Hi. Terra from SOMA Synths is yet another example of how this company thinks outside the box. And I'm not just talking about the shape of the enclosure and panel layout. Terra is the synth equivalent of Bruce Banner. Soft-spoken at first, but the more pressure you apply, the more likely things are gonna get out of control, as it turns into a raging hulk of a synth. Inside it are 32 factory-coded synth algorithms designed to respond to pressure-sensitive timbre and note sensors. And you can use these to play patches that sound like quote-unquote regular synth sounds. These engines or algorithms don't use a single internal synth control layout or matrix. Rather, it often seems like many of them are intended to unleash increasingly more chaos the more sensors you press at once, with more mod sources and cross-mods interacting with each other. Of course, the question is all this originality in control and synth structure something that would fit within your musical flow? To help you decide, in this video I'll take a detailed look at how Terra works, give you a taste of its sounds in the synth engines, and discuss its pros and cons overall. Before I start, a quick disclosure: SOMA sent Terra over for review, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's start at the surface level with an overview of what's going on here on the panel. You play notes on Terra using the 12 capacitive touch sensors. These respond either to taps with velocity sensitivity or gradual contact. The sensors don't move physically, rather they respond to the amount of skin touching them, which feels like applying pressure, but if you touch them lightly with a lot of skin, they'll reach maximum pressure too. Even though there are 12 of these, which implies semitones in an octave, each can be tuned individually to any note you like or any microtonal interval you like. They don't even need to go up, so if I wanted this to be pitched lower, I could do that by holding the pitchfork button and moving up and down either by semitone intervals, as you can see on the screen, or using the two bottom pitch shifters by microtonal intervals. So now sensor 11 is tuned to something totally different. So if you're playing and you're feeling that the pitch that you want to play isn't available on the panel, it's pretty easy to customize any of these to get to it. Then on the left are 4 additional capacitive touch sensors called the parametric keyboard or timbre sensors. These are for changing the timbre of a sound, and they're capacitive touch or pressure sensitive as well, and can be used simultaneously. These can affect different parameters based on the synth engine and the parameter settings of that synth engine. We'll get to that in a bit. But it can be anything from opening and closing a filter, increasing mod depths, changing pitch, or anything else. Another interesting concept in Terra are these pitch shifters. So I used them earlier to tune an individual sensor using the pitchfork button. But the really interesting thing they do is temporary transpositions of the note keyboard. So say if I play this chord, then by default this sensor is programmed to shift pitch an octave up, this one 2 octaves, this one an octave down, and another octave down. But you can program these to any interval you like, and if you press more than one of them at once, other intervals start to emerge. So as I press more than one of these at a time, I can get non-octave intervals, and this becomes a really interesting improvisational tool. So this is a real-time performance tool that applies on a per-note basis. If you want to, there's a shift function that transposes the entire keyboard. So say transpose it down by octaves and up by octaves, or by semitones. So this combo kind of works like the octave buttons you might find on a regular keyboard. Now there actually is a shortcut to set this note keyboard to boring old octave semitone intervals, in which case you can play a normal scale, but I don't think that's the point here. There's also a motion sensor inside an accelerometer, so if you place this on your lap or on something that will let it wiggle, then the engines can respond to this motion. There's actually 2 dimensions to this motion, and each synth engine can choose to respond to it differently. The final commercial release should also come with pads you can stick on the bottom that will also let it wiggle a bit. The built-in accelerometer also has a cool microphone mode. In this experimental algorithm, the gyro can act as a microphone. So here it's off, and this is sort of microphone mode. Anyway, continuing with the tour, beyond the note and timbre sensors, you've got quite a few touch-style buttons on the panel, some with LED indicators and some without. So for example, these 2 hold buttons will let you hold notes or timbre controls and then add notes to them, or add timbre control. And you can release the holds, of course. And then this triangular arrangement of 6 LED sensors is the closest thing Terra has to a touchscreen. It actually has around 11 different views or modes, so you can do quite a lot with it using various shift combos. By default, when you're not holding anything, it lets you set various engine parameters, but if you press the E button, then you can select engine banks with the 2 LEDs on top and specific algorithms using the 3 on the bottom. Or if I hold G, it lets you tune the sensitivity of the gyroscope, the accelerometer. So this is unsensitive, and then with increasing sensitivity, L lets you load presets, and S lets you save presets. And there are a few other things you can control with this, like MIDI modes. I'll get to that later. And continuing the tour, on top you've got 7 pot knobs. The 2 on the left and 3 on the right do the same thing across the different synth engines, and these 2, the water and light knobs, do different things depending on which engine you pick. These 2 control release envelopes, this one for notes, and this one for the parameter or timbre controls. So the longer the P envelope, the longer the timbre modification will stick around. So these always do the same thing regardless of the algorithm. Same for these. Overall volume control. And then here you've got control of the effects. You can choose either a reverb with mix control and release control, or an echo, a delay, again with time control and mix control as well. And then these 2 knobs, sea and sun or water and light, will typically control brightness or distortion and the LFO rate, but not necessarily. It can vary based on the algorithm. And then finally, for direct unshifted panel controls, if you've got notes that take a while to release and you want to shut them down, just press the power button and they'll be cut off. Beside the direct controls I mentioned, there are quite a few additional modes and shift functions that are activated using various button combos. I'll discuss a few of these later in the video. So that's it for the panel. Inside is a digital synth that comes with 32 factory engines grouped into 4 broad types, which you can select by pressing the engine button. And using these 2 LEDs, so when they're off, it's the polyphonic engine type. When the left one is on, it's the experimental bank. When the right one is on, it's the bass bank. And when both are on, it's the solo bank. And then once you've chosen a bank, so let's say I'll go for the polyphonic bank, you can choose one of 8 different engine options based on which combination of these LEDs is lit or not. So 8 in total per bank. As you may have noticed, I didn't mention this LED sensor when choosing engines. Currently it's off. What it does is cut in half the CPU rate of the synth. That automatically pitches everything an octave down, but also makes the modulation slower and everything else grittier. From a synthesis perspective, the engines aren't limited to any particular form of synthesis. There's subtractive, FM, wavetable, additive, physical modeling, even evil synthesis, which we'll get to, and various cross mods in here. For those of you who are going to ask, there's no open API for this, and you don't have access to the internal engine in any way. Once you load up an engine, you've got timbral control using a combination of the pressure you apply to the note keyboard, the pressure you apply to the timbre controls, the water and light knobs, and the 6 LED sensors. There's no general LFO or arpeggiator like there are envelopes, so if an algorithm has an LFO in it, like I mentioned, you can control its frequency and you can clock sync that frequency as well. If an engine has an arpeggiator in it, then you control its speed with the C or LFO rate knob, and you control the pattern, the arpeggiator pattern, using the light knob with a few options in between here. You can hold an arpeggiator pattern if you want, and then if you press additional keys, you'll add them to the pattern. Unfortunately, there's no option to replace a chord with a different chord like on most ARPs. And when you release the hold, it'll decay based on the release parameter. Holding timbral controls, by the way, works well for this. So let's say I've got this pattern and I want to mess around with its timbre. And I like this timbre, so I can just hold it, then add notes to the pattern, release the hold, and release the timbral controls too if I want. The last general thing you need to know about Terra is that it supports saving and loading up to 96 presets. Presets can include the different note intervals that you program, the engine you use, and the parameters you use within that engine. Gyro sensitivity settings, knob settings, all that can be saved within up to 96 presets, and these live in one of 6 banks. So let's say go into this bank, and then you load a preset within a bank using one of the 16 touch sensors. You can actually also save up to 24 pitch shifter presets. So remember these interval changers. There are 16 different shift combos here, so you can program these and save them too. In terms of connectivity, on the left, you've got 1/4-inch headphone outputs as well as balanced outputs, which is great. It comes with a wall wart. And on the right are MIDI in and out, including a USB Type-A host port for firmware updates and for backing up presets. The 5-pin DIN MIDI input doesn't accept notes or CC controls, at least not as of the current firmware. It's only intended for clock sync for the LFO and arpeggiator, but the same MIDI input also supports analog sync, both DIN sync and analog clock using this adapter, which comes with Terra. The MIDI out has 3 options, either notes and CCs, all CCs, or MPE. More on MIDI later. Okay, let's dive in a little bit deeper into the 32 synth engines. Now, this would typically be the part of the video where I explain what each knob, setting, and timbre control sensor of the synth does. Since there are 32 of these, I'm not going to do this for every engine. These are actually explained really nicely in the manual, but let me give you a few examples of what these all can do in a few different algorithms. So let's start, for example, with the first group, that's the polyphonic group, and say the first engine with none of the LEDs on, and let's turn off all the engine settings. So the engines more or less follow this rule where you get a nice calm Bruce Banner tone. If all the settings are off and there's no modulation, then things go to hell or to Hulk. When you apply more modulation, now you can feel your way around without the manual, but things aren't always that self-explanatory. So let me explain, for example, in this algorithm, this LED controls the pitch modulation for this sensor. So if I press this sensor without the LED on, that's the modulation I'll get. If I turn this on, that's the modulation I'll get. Same for this, it impacts this sensor. So again, pitch variation 1 and pitch variation 2. but it also impacts what happens with the B sensor. Something else that isn't quite obvious, this sensor LED changes what these three do in the algorithm. So when this is off, they do what I just showed you. When it's on, then the buttons on the bottom do something else, change the harmonic structure of the sound. This one activates bell mode, so the notes aren't sustained anymore, whereas they are if this isn't on. So different things based on different LED options. In this algorithm, for example, there's no LFO modulation, so this knob doesn't do anything unless you turn this on. And this determines the LFO rate. Then the light knob doesn't appear to do anything, but it does. It just changes the attack portion of the sound. So these are things you can figure out on your own, but having the manual nearby helps. One more setting I had a hard time figuring out in this algorithm without the manual is this memory control. So the idea here is that if this is off, then when I release the note, the timbre controls will still have impact over the released note's tail. If I turn memory on, then as I release the note and then release the timbre controls, it will sustain its timbre even though I've released these controls. I mention this because this memory option appears in quite a few algorithms. So that's one algorithm out of 32. Let's take a look at a few others. Sometimes the definitions in the manual aren't quite clear. For example, here, D is the wheel of samsara. And C is beyond good and evil. So that's evil synthesis for you. In many of these algorithms, holding more than one note at a time increases cross mods and chaos. What really surprised me is how broad of a range each individual algorithm can have. So these nice and gentle bells are actually part of the same algorithm we just heard going wild. And you can take this sound from the bells to chaos as you play with the parameter settings and the timbre modulation. Let's take a listen to how a different algorithm goes from nice and peaceful to slightly more aggressive in harmonics. So let's listen to the peaceful part a bit. And with slightly different settings. The manual says this algorithm is inspired by church organs. Let's start with no parameter adjustments. Now with a few changes. Let's make a minor tweak. There's gyro support here. And this is the same algorithm. And so is this. Still the church organ algorithm, just different settings in the triangle. Let's try a different algorithm, also in the polyphonic bank. Let's take a look at a few engines in the experimental bank. Some of these split up the keyboard into different regions, say for a drum kit. In this next algorithm, in the experimental category, you can glide between notes in each region. So there are 3 keyboard regions, each is monophonic, but you can play them polyphonically if you want. And just in case this algorithm is too calm for you, here's the same one with a few parameter changes. Let's try one more experimental algorithm. In this case, I've turned on the half speed or half sample rate setting. Let's swap banks and move to the bass bank. These algorithms are monophonic and they support smart glides, where you can glide between notes if you apply maximum pressure at the destination note. If you don't apply maximum pressure, then you'll get this little jump in the transition between notes. And remember, it's not really pressure, it's more skin contact. So coming in from up top is the best way to perform complete glides. This last bass sound is a good example of where it would be nice to be able to sequence these with MIDI and just play with the timbre controls as a sequence is running. The last bank is called the solo bank, the last engine bank. There are 8 engines in this, many of them are arpeggiated. Some of the engines sound a bit different, like this one, where there are nuanced differences in what the timbre controls do. Not all the engines in this bank are arpeggiated. This one, for example, I think speaks for itself. Okay, before we head out to the pros and cons, let's talk a bit about MIDI output support on Terra. You've got 3 MIDI modes, which you choose by pressing L, pitchfork, and this hold button. This means off, and I've got level down, so we won't hear anything. And then this is mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3 when both of these are off. In mode 1, these send out regular MIDI notes. and it is velocity sensitive. And then these send out MIDI CCs, which you can map to anything you want. Unfortunately, these knobs don't send MIDI out currently, and these don't send out polyphonic aftertouch, which I asked SOMA about and they were open to adding, so hopefully they do. Then in mode 2, these all send out MIDI CCs based on pressure, and you can see that on the MIDI monitor. And then mode 3 is MPE mode. In MPE mode, currently, it always sends maximum velocity, regardless of how hard you press the note. But once you do, then it will detect pressure polyphonically, or skin touch, obviously, polyphonically for multiple notes. And all the pitch shifter intervals work as well. So these get sent over MIDI too. And of course, as you tune these, that'll work as well. So like you can tune these individually. So pretty cool, certainly better to have this than not. For the regular MIDI mode, there is velocity detection, but there's a bit of latency as it determines velocity. The manual says 15 milliseconds, and it kind of feels like that. Not too bad though overall. Last but not least, pitch bends using the gyro sensor work as well. Monophonic pitch shift, of course. Okay, let's talk about some pros and cons for Terra. The thing is, like any other SOMA synth, it's not about how this competes as a mono synth or a polysynth or a drum machine or a workstation. Terra isn't any of those things, nor does it try to be. With Terra, it's not about being the best tool for accomplishing a certain task. Actually, it's probably about getting you carried away from accomplishing anything you thought you need to get done. So the pros for SOMA are only pros if you want something different. It's not the best of a certain regular category. It's its own category. It's something you get if you want an uncharted and chaotic synth engine with irregular controls on a panel that encourages you to use irregular scales and non-traditional musical intervals and key layouts. Now you can, of course, program these to notes in a regular semitone scale and just stick to regular octave transpositions on the pitch shifter. And Terra does have some lovely, tame engines in it. But if that's what you plan to do with it, I think you're missing the point. There are plenty of other synths that do normal way better. Once you do start exploring like any other SOMA synth, the rule is always be recording or always be ready to quickly be recording, because recreating a particular chaotic timbre or pitch shifted riff may not always be easy. So those are the pros. On the cons side, first, it takes a while to get an understanding of what the 10 or so LED modes do and are, and which presets are banks in the engine modes and which are banks in the load and save modes, or how to edit and save pitch shifter presets. Certainly for the algorithm settings, I certainly can't memorize what 6 different toggles do across 32 different engines. Now, it's not that you can't explore it without knowing what each of these does. You certainly can, and just feel your way around. But if you want to make the most of each engine and this synth, prepare to reference the manual as you move between engines, and same goes for some of the non-obvious key combos and other menu options. And then finally, I think it would be nice if they added the ability to sequence and control Terra using the MIDI input that it already has. Right now, this only accepts MIDI and analog clock, and it seems to me like an arbitrary limitation, and that adding full MIDI note and expression control would add a lot of value without really taking anything away. Obviously, it wouldn't play or feel like this, and it wouldn't pitch shift, but even as a desktop module, say connected to an Osmos, there are some pretty kick-ass timbres in here. So that's it for Terra. If you liked the insights in this video, you might enjoy my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.